welcome to TPOW, the psychology of whatever, where each episode we enter into a world of great comedy sketch, a pop song, artwork, and explore its psychological themes and how it influences our minds, emotions, happiness and work through our day-to-day lives. So I'm Jeff Downs, welcome. I'm a comedy writer and podcaster. And John, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
And you are?
I'm a psychologist. And I like to think about entertainment in terms of what it means, maybe in terms of psychological thinking, maybe, or the way that we might investigate it and talk about it and develop a narrative about it.
Brilliant. That's John Woods. So, and finally...
I'm Tony Kinsella. I'm a full-time teacher. And I'm a part-time stand-up comedian and performance poet, and 25% of a group called Bard Company. Not Bad Company, Bard Company.
Bard Company. They're very good. I've seen them live. They're brilliant. So listen, what we're going to talk about today is Teenage Kicks, which was a classic song by the Undertones, who are a band from, quite rightly, Tony's not Belfast, Derry.
And we have to say Derry and not London Derry because they're on that side of the divide.
Okay, so they're from Derry. So this song came out in...
It's 1977 when John O'Neill wrote it, and it was recorded for Good Vibrations in 1978 in Belfast.
Okay, so this is... So the Teenage Kicks, and I think... Today with the psychology behind a lot of stuff. So classic pop songs, the 3-minute pop song through generations, from Elvis to the Beat, whatever. It's always been a defining moment for a generation. So I think that's why we all selected Teenage Kicks. I think we agreed, didn't we? It was a real sort of pinnacle in outrage and sort of. The sort of song's intensity. So let's just have a quick listen as a play, the Undertones and Teenage Kicks. Classic. John, what did you... First, psychological thoughts.
Right. What I thought was, first of all, was to ask people who were there, as it were, what themes they thought were behind that song. Okay. To which, really asking more generally, they just said libido. Okay.
Right. Okay.
With the lyrics, okay, which is it because it's about the opposite sex for the singer. And I gave it some more thought about what are the narratives around it and where they might spin off to, okay, that we could explore. And this was, but it's my generation exploring it. It's me looking at it. And I also asked my son, so what occurred to him when he heard it and looked at the words?
Right. Okay.
So I started to think about, this is a song, a bit like The Who's My Generation. Using teenage builds a group that enjoys that subculture or can feel part and connected to the particular audience that band is performing to.
Yeah. Well, just hold with that thought there. Just to say, do you remember when it came out, John? And how did it affect you at the time, or were you conscious of it?
At the time, if I'm honest, culturally, I was in a different bubble.
Go on.
I was a heavy metal fan.
Okay.
And heavy metal fans didn't listen to punk.
Right, okay. And what was your...
In my culture or my...
That's fine. What was your song at that point you were listening to?
At that point, I'll be honest, it was status quo, whatever you want.
Okay, fair enough. That's
okay.
I'm a bit
that
of a
was my song.
Tony, what was your...
Oh, the Undertones were very much my thing. I was very much a punk. and I'd been listening to things like the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt, and then as soon as punk arrived, I rejected all that, and I was just a kind of, didn't look like a punk, but in terms of my musical taste, it was punk all the way, and the Undertones were my number one band.
So punk was and there's other songs along the way that I think for me, I suppose Who was a big thing for me. So any of the Who songs, and I think My Generation is a classic 3-minute sort of primal scream. I'm rebelling against society. Sorry, John, God, just to sort of give an idea of where we're all at. So carry on.
Well, because you're opening up an avenue to a kind of my thinking is where the young people in 1977, 78, the punk sort of culture, was that about joining different groups that have different belief systems around music that separated people. And that's interesting. It would be good to talk to, say, a lot of our generation about that, but then also talk to young people about whether they've got similar those subgroups these days. It doesn't seem apparent to me, but I've not spoken to them about it. But this particular identity around what a particular group likes musically at the time was a badge of identity, as I understand it. People belonged to different groups. They were either heavy metal kids or they were punks. There was a little bit of a subculture of mods, as I recall. But again, I'd like to explore that. I'm sure there's books about it. And then you can go, if the psychologically, that's the need which has been looked at, or the inclination of young people to join gangs, to join comrades and have support from peers. And that's very important as far as the psychology of young people goes, is to belong to a tribe. Very often they use the word tribe.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely big in the Who, and I can talk a little bit about, especially Mods and Rockers. That was a big thing, and that was gang warfare, wasn't it?
In terms of what you're saying as well, John, I think, you said you listened to a lot of heavy metal. To make a heavy metal record, I guess the bands had to send in audition tapes and audition and play the game of the record labels. One of the things about punk in general is it was very much DIY, that bands could just go into bog standard studios, record it the way they wanted to, send it to the John Peel show, which is very much what happened with Teenage Kicks, and you can suddenly find yourself with a career in the music industry. But I think with the Undertones, you've also got to put it in the context of the whole Derry and Londonderry thing, because the Undertones were very much on the Catholic side, the Derry side, as opposed to the Londonderry side, and there was a lot of conflict going on. And there's a documentary about the Undertones where the music journalist Paul Morley, there was bands like Stiff Little Fingers at the time who were doing very political stuff about what was going on in Ireland. The Undertones sang about girls and summer and chocolate, and Paul Morley, the journalist, said it was probably the most radical thing that a group of teenagers living in the Cregan estate of Derry could do, to not sing about politics but to sing about going out and having a good time and enjoying yourself. So it's kind of radical in its own way.
Yeah, that I was thinking about that a lot, about why this song didn't have a political content for the two reasons that we've talked about. One, punk as a culture as anti-establishment, and two, about the sectarianism.
Yeah.
And neither are there.
No.
And some people have said, like one of my friends said, Here Comes the Summer's his favourite record.
Yeah.
Because it's optimistic.
Yeah.
And maybe the world needed a bit of optimism at that time, and they filled the gap. Now, was that a cynical, market-driven, there's a gap in the market, or was it genuinely a band that just wanted to be happy, almost like hippies in a way? Let's all be happy and love each other and have a good time, and this is what happens. It's not negative, is it?
It was very much the latter. There's absolutely no way the Undertones had some genius marketing strategy. They were all about 16 and 17 at the time they made that record, hence Teenage Kicks. And as you say, having got to know the Undertones and spoken to John O'Neill in particular, who wrote the song, it was very much about, we were watching all this stuff on the TV, all the kind of pitch battles on the streets every day. And the Undertones lived right in the heart of all that. the kind of conflict. So they didn't want to sing songs reflecting the misery that they were going through every day. They wanted to break out of that. And when
it was
people
about
went out for
escapism.
absolutely about escapism. Yeah.
So Tony, if I could quickly just ask Tony and a point you made, John, about tribalism. So almost the Undertones rejected tribalism.
Yeah.
And there's a scene in the film, isn't there, of Good Vibrations where they're driving.
It's actually a different band called Rudy. So there's a film called Good Vibrations.
Tony, to say, there's a scene in the film where there's both the band are going somewhere, and isn't there like Protestants and Catholics in the back of the van? And so it quite literally, that scene says
it's not actually the Undertones in that. So it's in the film that's the Undertones feature in called Good Vibrations, about Good Vibration Records, which was Terry Hooley's record shop and record label in Belfast, and he tried to launch another band before the Undertones who were called Rudy, RUDI, and they were playing a gig out of Derry and were trying to drive back in late at night, and because it was a group of blokes in a van, the paramilitary stopped them and were very suspicious that they could be terrorists or gunmen. So they showed the guitars and the amps, and they accepted that they were a band and had been played out of town. So the police officer said to Terry Hooley, the driver, are these guys Catholics or Protestants? And half of them said we're Catholics and the other half said we're Protestants. So the police officer couldn't quite believe it and said, you've got Catholics and Protestants in the same band? And his answer was, well, to be honest, I never even thought of asking, and that's a wonderful world to live in. I have to say it wasn't the world of the Undertones. Mickey Bradley, the bass player of the Undertones, says in his biography very clearly that if any of the Undertones had been Protestants, then the band would never have existed.
Okay, so there's an interest. Oh, really?
Wow.
That was a there we are, slight, almost rejection from a band, but it never happened. But thankfully they carried on. John, carry on. So it's good.
Right. So
sorry, go on. You were saying about the tribalism.
Well,
you've been
if I pull it. Well, if I put it into psychology, okay, so I'm looking at this song and I'm thinking, obviously because of the if you like, cognitive lens through which I'm interpreting it, I'm thinking the Troubles.
So what is that?
I'm
Sorry,
thinking
just
about,
for people that won't be used to terminology, cognitive lens. What's that in sort of my language, because I'm a bit thick. So I hear cognitive all the time, and that just means what does that mean?
Thoughts, thinking.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Right.
And I'm sure. So I'm using that phrase. I probably picked it up from somewhere. I can't remember exactly to reference it, but I'm bringing a certain thought structure that from my experience, I will analyse the world, my experience, because of what's happened to me. So because I'm aware of things like the Troubles, sectarianism, punk, heavy metal, I will use those then to categorise and to make sense of the world. That's the explanation I'm giving for the way that I'm looking at this song. Now, if in psychologists, they'll often use the term metacognition. So what I'm doing at the moment is thinking, well, why did I think that? And it really brought it up when I compared what I thought about the song and what my son thought about it. So I was thinking about, teenage identity, my generation, The Who, rebellion. I was thinking about the Troubles as well. Yeah. When I'm all alone, I was reading, I wonder if the girl that he's seen is an opposite religion to what he's meant to be. Was that about it being clandestine?
Right.
So I kind of put in a reality onto this song, which, I've not spoken to the songwriter. And I'm sure I could be put right on things, but I'm assuming certain things about the motive behind things, even if it's coded, little words are coded. So I'm looking at all that. I did go into the crush and the libido, and I didn't know whether the song was to celebrate a certain liberality from what would have been quite a religiously strict community, but that's supposition. So my metacognition is saying I'm assuming that based on what I've heard and read. So when I asked my son to listen to it and to respond to it, so he's just approaching 15, and I said, "What do you think about this? What do you think about this?"
Yeah.
His take was really interesting. I said, "Do you like it?" He said, "I don't like the singing."
Okay.
But I like the guitar and I like the rhythm.
Okay.
Something there to be explored musically about what makes this a great pop song.
Yeah.
We could do, and we could research that. He did talk about this. He just wants to get off with a girl.
Yeah.
That's what the song's about. He wants to get off with her. He sees somebody. He did say, and maybe he wants some romance. And he wishes the girl could be romantic.
Yeah.
You know, and then he said, I think he's fantasizing.
Yes.
He's making it all up in his head about the potential of having a relationship with a girl. And he used the phrase, who's out of his league.
Okay.
But not probed any further than that. But what was interesting, I mean, this is one person. So what I would really like to do is ask, say, 150-year-olds about it who were there, and 100 14, 15-year-olds about it, and analyse the responses as an open interview, doing in psychology what's called a thematic analysis, what themes are coming out. But what he's much more pure in the sense, and then pure is my description, because he thinks about it as his reaction. He doesn't have the baggage of the Troubles or cultural structures or the establishment or punk.
Yes.
Because he doesn't have that upbringing. He's living in where he is now, which is a much more immediate response. You know, and if I was a market researcher, those are the things I would really like to discuss with young people to find out how they interact with music, especially these days. I mean, the big question of my research, should I ever get funding for this, would be, would Teenage Kicks be a hit record if it were released these days? Could it be a hit record? I think those fascinating questions about the generality between generations.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. The brilliant points. Tony, do you want to...
Well, three points in response to what you say. One about the hit record thing, one about the libido, and one about the simplicity of the song. If I ask you, John, what do you think it was its highest chart position for Teenage Kicks, what would your best guess be?
That's a good question. I have absolutely no idea.
I don't
number two.
Yeah,
You'd say number two. What would you say, Jeff?
Well, I'd say it was top 10, so either number 3, number 2, or number 1.
Right, it was number 31 was the highest chart position it ever got to.
Hey.
They had much bigger hits with songs like Wednesday Week and My Perfect Cousin and It's Going to Happen. But these songs are nothing like as resonant with today's public as it's been released several times, but it's never got above 31. And lots of other bands have covered it and so on. So that's one thing about whether it would be a hit today. It wasn't particularly a massive hit in its day, bizarrely, and yet it somehow endured. In terms of the simplicity of the songwriting, I actually have a text in front of me from John O'Neill who actually wrote it, and I actually asked him just this morning, funnily enough, because we kind of got to know each other when I did my show, and his response, I asked him how he feels about the song now, and he says, I still believe it's the raw sound of the record that makes it so loved. The song itself isn't that special. That's what's so fantastic about rock and roll. You can capture something so universal without ever being aware you're doing it. It's all about attitude. That's why punk is so special. So I think, you know, that from the horse's mouth, that answers some of your questions.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you for just getting it.
Yeah, but just very quickly on the libido, a little story. Fergal Sharkey, when he said your son didn't like the vocals, he is a bit of an acquired taste. I love his vocal, but not everybody does. But he was the one member of the Undertones who never wrote any songs, but they were being interviewed on Irish television. This journalist who hadn't done any background asked Fergal Sharkey what the song was about. So John O'Neill was sitting next to him and was waiting for Fergal to say, "Oh, you got it wrong, I didn't write it, this guy wrote it." But Fergal Sharkey instead said, "Yes, when I wrote it, it was all about masturbation." And as he said it, John O'Neill had never remotely even thought about the song being about masturbation. He told me that he only started playing guitar in a band because he wanted to get a girlfriend, and it was very much what you spoke about before, about first love and first relationship. And that completely soured the relationship between Fergal Sharkey and the rest of the band. He was the one who decided to quit after 4 albums. And they actually reformed in 1999, but with a different lead singer called Paul McClune. And they said they never even asked Fergal because nobody wanted him around anymore. He obviously went on to some solo hits, but the Undertones would never have asked him to rejoin the band because there was so much sour grapes between them by then.
That's very interesting.
So there we go. So that's an interesting aspect of how the...
But the lyric is so loose that it could be about masturbation. The person who wrote it says it definitely wasn't, but it is a potential interpretation.
I mean, I'm going to collide two worlds here, because I did a music course called From Composition to Performance, and the whole music course was about, does the composer, or how much does the composer retain the artistic product, and how much does it develop a life of its own that people adapt for their own purposes? And I think it's really interesting, and what I'd like to do is look at John O'Neill's themes that he thinks are about behind it. How come Fergal Sharkey came to his themes and his perspective and almost stole the ownership from it, and how come my son came up with his own themes and myself and go around so the psychology would be, how do people arrive at these themes from a piece of art, shall we say, that where the composer intended one thing but didn't really have the foresight or even countenance thinking what its impact would be and how people would process it. Those are the fascinating things about our culture that I think are fascinating to look into as a psychologist, about how people process the cultural landscape.
Yeah, John,
and the cultural experience.
can I just ask you something? What with you describing the themes of each individual, and when you were talking about tribalism, now as humans we can be very protective of ideas. Is there tribalism in our own thoughts? You talked about cognitive lens, and so and we all do it, when you come up with an idea where you think, oh, that's my idea, you're quite protective. So in our own actual thought patterns, would you say we're quite tribal? We're our own tribe, and we don't want to give something away. Obviously, that's where a lot of conflict can happen in bands, because there's infighting classically through all the big bands, because it's, well, I wrote that bit, you didn't write that bit, I wrote da-da-da. So that's my question to you.
Do you mean rather than tribal suggests a group? So do you mean you only want certain people to appreciate it? It's like some bands seem to celebrate, as I understand it. Again, I've not read any specific research about it. Some bands take comfort in the fact that there's only a certain type of person, shall we say, or group of people like them. They want to be alternative. They don't want to be mainstream. That's my impression. Or does every band want to be mainstream and say, you know what, we'd love this to be on the Tony Blackburn show, because John Peel, he was an alternative DJ, and the people who listened to John Peel knew they were in a tribe of a certain level of appreciation of music that the rest of the population said, well, that's just noise. Yeah. And I'm interested in that, about, do people like something because other people don't like it? Yeah. And to what extent did they do that? So that's one aspect. The other aspect would be, hang on a minute, I'm the artist. I want credit for it. You can't take it from me. And there was, that can be studied and has been studied about how one artist takes ideas from another's. And from what I understand, until copyright laws became a feature of the structure of society, that was done all the time. That's what folk music is, isn't it? Yeah. You'll have a folk tune and it's 3 different tunes by 3 different writers who write different lyrics. And there wasn't that preciousness and ownership of music saying, this is my bass line, this is my vocal. But because also these days there's a financial implication to that about the royalties you get and the copyright, and maybe that makes people more protective. So their processes then, hang on, that's mine. Where hitherto 200 years ago, oh, you can have my tune, do you enjoy it? Yeah, well, I'd be flattered if you would pass it off as your own, because it means it's been. And I believe Ruddy Guthrie never took any money for any records. He only took money for live performances. Really? And I understand he didn't believe in it. Okay, he didn't believe in copyright.
Well, there's a whole podcast on plagiarism, and Led Zeppelin have been sort of accused, and all the blues bands sort of hold. Yes. Tony, you wanted to say? Yeah, something?
I mean, just briefly, you mentioned John Peel, so I just thought it was worth mentioning his role in the whole thing. That he was apparently it's supposed to be the only time he ever played the same record record twice, and there's various stories around this. But in fact, when the Undertones made a comeback in 1999, the opening track of the first album was called Thrill Me, and John Peel actually played that one twice, I think with a lovely sense of irony. And of course, the opening line of Teenage Kicks, A Teenage Dream So Hard to Beat, is on John Peel's gravestone, just simply his real name, John Ravenscroft. Yes. You were talking about the tribalism and people who listen to them. What's fascinating in terms of the Undertones, they made 4 albums before they split and Fergal Sharkey left, and the first 2 albums are all Here Comes the Summer, Try to Get a Girlfriend, Chocolate, a song about Mars bars, all sorts of stuff. But if you listen to the third album, The Positive Touch, they suddenly start to get very political, and about 75% of that album is kind of about, you know, infighting and sectarianism and all that type of thing. And when I met John O'Neill, he explained that, you know, he was 16 when he wrote Teenage Kicks, but by the time they got to the third album, he was 21-ish. So he was reading different types of books, he was reading different newspapers, he was watching different types of film. He was more impacted as he was kind of getting married, and you know, people reacting to his marriage. So suddenly, the Undertones did evolve into never as much as Stiff Little Fingers, who incidentally had a journalist writing all their lyrics for them, but that's another story. But the Undertones did actually evolve from that basic punk band. And just one last thing that I meant to mention before, John O'Neill describes his writing technique when you were asking about the way songs are composed. He was listening to Iggy Pop, Dr. Feelgood, Talking Heads, but in particular, he was a huge fan of the Ramones. And he said he learned his songwriting techniques just by listening to Ramones albums. And he actually called it the 3-chord trick. Not the 3-card trick, but the 3-chord trick.
Yeah.
He said if you've got 3 chords and an attitude, you can make successful albums in the punk genre.
So, in this day and age, would the Ramones seek to get financial redress from the Undertones and say, well, you lifted our approach?
I would like to think not. The only time one of those things goes to court is if the tune is too derivative of an original tune, isn't it, My Sweet Lord, and the old 60s song. I think what they took from the Ramones, or what he took from the Ramones, putting words into his mouth, was the kind of attitude, the energy. And lots of bands had that. Susie and the Banshees had it, the Damned had it. So, you know, I'm not saying the Ramones were necessarily ripped off and, mined for all their treasures. It's just that they inspired people in the same way that Kraftwerk inspired, hundreds and hundreds of techno bands.
John, you were just to go back with your son, when sort of thoughts of so he sort of wasn't mad about the vocals, but he liked the sort of tune and the song. Was there anything else that came out of that when you played it to him in his thoughts?
That was about it. On what he was willing to reveal. Really, there was those areas of romance and libido and fantasy. And what's he
into? What's his sort of Teenage Kick songs? Then what's music he into?
Well, I guess approaches a little bit of what we were alluding to earlier. He doesn't listen to contemporary music. He listens to 50 years worth of music. So his listening will range from Led Zeppelin to Nirvana.
Okay.
Not much more contemporary than that, I would say.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's
whether that's been a golden age and that's the canon.
Yes,
not really punk. It tends to be more on the heavy guitar side, rhythm.
Well, is there and also can we talk? Is there another offshoot of what boys and girls and men and women will listen to when they're young, and what boys like, and what teenage songs to them, like the Who, that was very much a male following because it was tribal, it was the Mods, it was Scooters. But then if you look at females and what they, the girl bands, and,
absolutely,
and so there's a whole thing there, isn't there?
There's a whole research project in that about what if say girls are listening to it, what are they listening for? What things resonate with them? What sort of ideas? And then, so you've got the gender differences. Then you've got the age differences. What does a 50-year-old do? 50-year-olds tend to live in the past of when they picked up tunes in their teens? And is there a sort of psychological window between the ages of, 11 and 25, maybe? I mean, that's supposition. Yeah. Is there a psychological window when you are more susceptible to the influence of music on you emotionally?
Yeah. And it does seem to be, and in Teenage Kicks, taking the actual word teenage, because you're technically only a teenager for 13 to 19. It's technically 6 years. 6 years that you are this, volatile person. Tony, you wanted to come in?
I was just going to say, again, reacting to what you said, the Undertones show that I took to Derry, I actually did it as a collaboration with a singer-songwriter called Steve O'Donoghue, and he sang some of his own songs, but he also sang some of the Undertones songs, including Teenage Kicks, which we ended on as part of the narrative. And I texted Steve to ask for it, because he had to play the songs in front of the people who wrote them, because 3 of the Undertones were in the audience that night. And I asked him about the experience of learning the song, and he's 10 years younger than me, so he doesn't remember it first time round, but he said his uncle used to play it, and that he started to, a bit like you and your son really, he said he started to identify with the whole thrill of the chase when he started to discover girls, and he also said, in a text that I asked him, he said, "The song has never ever gone away, and if you search, you'll find it somewhere. You'll find it playing somewhere in the world. It's remained relevant to so many generations. You can't sum it up. It's art, and it just speaks to you directly." And what interests me about that, your point before about the lyrics. I mean, American Pie by Don McLean. I heard him talking about it on the radio the other day, and people theorise that the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost is Bob Dylan, John Lennon, and Mick Jagger, but he's never confirmed that. Elvis Costello is very vague about what his songs are all about. He's very cryptic. But at the end of the day, we're talking about Teenage Kicks, which is an incredibly simple lyric. So it's interesting that Fergal Sharkey can interpret it differently. Your son can interpret it differently. Maybe words don't have to be particularly complicated in order for people to take something different from them.
Or maybe that's the thing what great art does. It can be reborn in any generation and provoke some sort of thought about that resonates with that time.
Yeah,
it's almost like a mirror.
Yeah.
And I suppose it should, and it does play a role in, and that it can be handed down to generations further on. And it's great that you've played that to your son, John. So, final thoughts then, John, about Teenage Kicks and the song, and your whole sort of investigation into it.
My final thought is one of the most fascinating things for me, because that was thrown up with the discussions I had about it, was the difference between how my son viewed it and his interpretation and thought processes, that cognitive lens that I talked about. Maybe he doesn't have one. Maybe he's just open to whatever comes his way. And what I brought to it with my, shall we say, baggage. And that would be something that if we were looking at psychology, I would like to explore. I'm not sure whether it's already been done, but I'd like to explore.
That's someone on the phone now wanting to explore it.
They'll have to wait. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
It's one of those things with home working, isn't it?
No, that's fine. That's fine. This is the lockdown session.
It's the lockdown session. So I'd love to see what that window is, if it's not already been researched, when people are very, very susceptible emotionally to particular types of music that they remember. I don't know if you've probably seen on Facebook, there's this 10 vinyl albums that have... people are using to say this influenced my musical tastes, and everybody's putting their 10 albums up. That would be a great piece of research psychologically about why and what age people were, what went through their minds. Is there commonality, or is it different for everybody?
And because music is so personal to everybody, and it is, and when you sometimes ask, the amount of times, and I have asked people, go, give us your top 3 albums just now.
That's right.
They stall, they break out in a sweat, go, I couldn't possibly. It's there, and it's so interesting when you just say that to someone, the fear and dread that they had to have to commit, because it is so personal. Tony,
can I just ask you, John, what year your son was born?
2005.
So we're talking about a song that was written in 1977, and we're talking about the timelessness of it. I just wonder if you're investigating lyrics about whether some songs are kind of stuck in a certain time. And the only line in Teenage Kicks that strikes me interesting with your phone ringing there is, I'm going to call her on the telephone. And I wonder whether that's a typical line that your son would use nowadays in the age of social media and texting. And we tend to use the word mobile rather than telephone. So I don't know whether that line is dated. I mean, it's not exactly a complicated line, but I just wonder whether songs from the 1970s are going to lose resonance for somebody born in the noughties because certain references don't make any sense.
Really interesting that. It did occur to me that I thought, would telephone have any meaning for him, and I didn't explore it exactly, and whether that lyric would date. Would which is the one I'm going to write down and write myself a letter.
I know the song, yeah.
Yes.
I can't
These
remember,
things, maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll put the flags out for him. I don't know. I'll do semaphore. But it'd be interesting to know which lyrics have dated and identified, and that would be a whole project in itself, and how people will... how language changes so that younger generations don't fully connect with it. It didn't seem to stop it. Maybe that one line is insignificant to the overall theme, so therefore it didn't. Or maybe someone somewhere would go, telephone.
Just on that theme, I watch some of these television channels like Alibi, where they show all the old Inspector Morse. I quite like Shoestring, which is a very old detective series, and 90% of the situations that people get themselves in, there'd be no problem nowadays. You just whip out your mobile and ring somebody. It's really interesting watching detective shows from that pre-mobile era, where the plots revolve around people not being able to get in touch.
Well, the little point about that, which is very interesting, I know my son, he's been watching a program, and I can't remember what it's called now, but it's set in the 1980s, and because of it, he's begun to understand what life and ask questions about what life was like in the 1980s, which I think so maybe through film and television, actually, young people will, as things appear in the media, almost nostalgic for that time, they will gain an understanding of what it was like.
No, and how the lyrics would. Yes, verse 2. I'm going to call her on the telephone, have her over because I'm all alone. That's going to be now rechanged to I'm going to call her on my mobile. I'll send her a text and I'll meet her on Snapchat. That's updating the lyrics are quick. That's me having a go at it. But yes, it's a brilliant song. It's a classic song.
Can I just ask John one other thing as well? I want a discussion point. The very famous opening line of Teenage Kicks is a teenage dream so hard to beat, and I just wonder whether people are grabbed by a rhetorical question. I'm thinking of the Shangri-La's leader of the pack. Is she really going out with him? And there's certain, songs that open with a question. I wonder. My whole show was triggered by my thought about that question. Are teenage dreams so hard to beat? Do we ever fulfil our teenage dreams? Do we ever kind of, end up in the place where we thought we would be as teenagers? I just wonder whether the theme of rhetorical questions in pop songs would be an interesting one to investigate.
It'd be fantastic. And now you're saying that, one of the things... would a teenager really consider that rhetorical question? But someone who's mature would consider it. So therefore, the song has grown at the maturity. It's matured with the person, hasn't it? As well as being an immediate thing, which is an interesting point.
Well, the show that I wrote, it was based on the fact that I saw the Undertones in 1983 at Leeds University when I was an undergraduate.
Right.
And I saw the reformed version of them in 2017. So... me and they're more or less contemporaries of me. They're all roughly the same age. So both of us had elapsed 35 years between those two gigs. Okay. So my show was the two parallel stories, and you're absolutely right. That would not have dawned on me when I saw them the first time. But then seeing them 35 years later, what happened to my teenage dreams? I was just about still a teenager when I saw them in 83.
Yeah. And maybe that is great art, that you can... It still has questions to provoke in you, whatever age you are. And it kind of carries it with you. Maybe that's the sign of a great song.
It is a timeless classic. And so John, have you got anything else to add, or is that your?
I'm good. That's a very interesting discussion.
Well, thank you very much for your input, and they're fascinating. And as always, there's so many offshoots. There's so many things we're discussing. But in future episodes, we can always come back to other themes and look at those. So thank you, John. And so Tony, just to close the podcast today, just tell us you're going to read out a poem. Just tell us a little backstory.
Yeah, just one of the. We mentioned about how surprised everybody was that Teenage Kicks never got higher than 31. The other story that I think surprises people, it was never meant to be the lead track on that particular EP. So the first EP they made, there's a track called True Confessions that was the one that the Undertones wanted to promote. And when they were putting the label together at Good Vibrations, they rang them and said, what are we going to give as a title for this EP? There was 4 tracks on it. So whoever answered the phone just said, Well, there's four of us were teenagers, call it Teenage Kicks because that was one of the tracks. So when John Peel received the package and it was labelled Teenage Kicks, he just naturally assumed that was the song they wanted him to play. And had he played True Confessions, history may have been so different, because that was their really massive break.
It was an accident.
It was purely accidental that he played Teenage Kicks. They were amazed when they heard that track going out on the radio, and then even more amazed when he decided to play it twice because he loved it so much. So, shows how much the artist knows. So when I was researching my show, I read a biography about the Undertones by Mickey Bradley, who's the bass player. And he said that. So the title of the book was "My Life as an Undertone." Sorry, I'm just going into the poem now, John. So the
sorry, I'm just going to get rid of this.
It's all right.
That's right.
So the title of the poem was "My Life as an Undertone," and as I started to write the show, I started to reflect on that title, and I thought if you spell Undertone with a capital U, then there's only the five members in the original band and then Paul McClune, who replaced Fergal Sharkey. You could say that they lived their life as an undertone. But if you spell undertone with a small u, I would say that just about everybody on the planet would say to an extent, we all lived our life as an undertone. So I wrote this poem and you'll recognise the first line. A teenage dream so hard to beat. I just stayed put on easy street. Wrapped in a cotton wool comfort zone. I lived my life as an undertone. I wrote a few gags, some laughs, some groans. It was a game of chance, not a game of thrones. With all the romance of a Toblerone, I lived my life as an undertone. I went into teaching in a roundabout way, because I had loads of bills to pay. It was hippie hooray for the holidays, but moans and groans from teenage clones all fiddling with their mobile phones. I lived my life as an undertone. I raised two sons, often alone, patching up our broken home to make the misplaced pieces fit. I never got the full picture, but I kind of got the gist of it. I think I made a half-decent fist of it. I couldn't be prouder of how they've grown. To some, I'm much louder than an undertone. Imagine that. We can't all win an Olympic gold, a Nobel Prize or an OBE, but we're all destined to grow a little bit older, a little bit wiser, a little bit free. So battle through the collateral damage. Become the version of you that's the best you can manage. Do nobody harm. Do a little bit of good. Be proud of who you are. Be proud of your blood, your battle scars and your lovely bones. Be proud you lived your life as an undertone. A teenage dream so hard to beat. Our teenage dreams so hard to beat.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony. That was wonderful.
Excellent.
Excellent stuff. And so thank you to Tony Kinsella. Thank you, John Woods. Thank you to John O'Neill, who gave us the song.
Yes.
And thank you
God
to the Undertones for giving us that the classic. So that's it. That's been TPOW, the psychology of whatever. And next episode, who knows what we're going to look at. So thanks for listening. Take care. Goodbye.